Hello everyone! Today we will discuss the book by Daniel A.Bell, The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy.
We will outline the main theses and ideas presented in this book and share our impressions.
Why China is taken as a model? What is meritocracy?
According to the author, China, with its long and unique history, has developed a new, completely different system from the very familiar to us electoral democracy.
She calls Chinese-style political meritocracy and describes it as a morally legitimate way of selecting top political leaders on the basis of their talent and virtue, in other words, merit. The goal of his work is to show that democracy is not the only possible system and there is the meritocracy that has even more compelling future, and political meritocracy can be a decent alternative for the electoral democracy. To prove his idea, he provides numerous arguments.
First, Daniel Bell states the problems of democracy, which are the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the minority, the tyranny of the voting community, and the tyranny of competitive individualists.
The idea of tyranny of the majority comes from Plato and Aristotle. Daniel Bell explains, for Plato, rule of the many meant that simple-minded citizens can easily be swayed by the emotive arguments of demagogues, leading to injustices such as the death penalty for his teacher Socrates. The term itself was popularized by Mill, 19th century British philosopher. The main problem with the tyranny of the majority is that voters in the masses don't have enough time, incentive and necessary political knowledge to be able to make rational decisions and decide the future of the government by electing certain officials.
The second problem with democracy is the tyranny of the minority. The power of big but not funded and organized groups of people is nothing compared to wealthy and organized small groups who have the most resources, skills, and influence to lobby for policies that benefit only their own interests, as the author writes. The solution for this problem of inequality is to make rich care about less well-off, and the way to do this, in author's opinion, is to create a sense of community that emerges from common social interaction. Daniel Bell provides an example of Japan, where rich are willing to comply with high tax rates and wealth redistribution because they feel a sense of solidarity with the rest of society as they share common traditions and follow the same everyday rituals. China is as well on the way of creating a sense of solidarity among the rich and powerful by practicing a political training that expects the would-be leaders to get an experience of working in different poor areas, mixing with different social classes.
The third problem is the tyranny of the voting community. In electoral democracy, those who do not have a legal right to participate in elections are neglected. These groups are the foreigners and future generations, and other non-voters who live in the country contribute to its functioning, but their interests are nonetheless left unheard. Author provides an example of global warming as a pivotal issue for the future generations that should be addressed now, but in electoral democracies it is hardly possible to solve the problem as it requires long-term sacrifices, in which officials are not interested as they only concerned about the elections and tenure. Conversely, in China, the CCP is interested in preparing for both long-term and short-term disasters as the level of performance of government contribute to its legitimacy.
And the last problem stated by author is the tyranny of competitive individualists. Daniel Bell argues that competition in electoral democracy leads to demonization of political rivals and the emergence of identity politics, which in turn causes social division that disrupts social harmony that is actually highly valued by people.
Then the author proposes his ideas on what should be considered as the criteria of a good leader and how it can be checked. Daniel Bell says that a good politician should live for politics, and that distinguishes them from bureaucrats who simply live off politics implementing decisions that they are unable to influence. Politicians, in contrast, have enough power to impact the future of a country. Hence, they need to have a deep knowledge of politics and be able to analyze and resolve problems rationally. But before, they should care for society with its diverse groups and interests. From this derive the main characteristics of a good leader: intellectual ability, social skills, and virtue. Intellectual skills are the most easy to test, and China model of examination system is the most impressive, though it has its imperfections such as cheating, the problem that awaits to be eliminated. However, outstandingly high intellectual abilities will not be enough for a good politician. What is more important are social skills and emotional intelligence. The main obstacle is the difficulty in measuring the level of social skills in practice. And the author's proposal is to require an evidence of good performance at lower levels of government after the examination as a condition for further promotion up the chain of political command.
The last but not the least important criterion mentioned by the author is virtue. Political leaders should know how to bring benefit to people and should strive to work for people's good. Bell's idea on the possible way of measuring the virtue is first, demonstrate the good intentions by doing a volunteer work, and the second is for leaders to be assessed by his supervisors, peers, and subordinates. Such three-level system of evaluation will provide more objective and expanded information.
Author indicates three key problems of implementing political meritocracy in the context of China. These are the problem of corruption, the problem of stagnation of political hierarchy, and lastly, the problem of legitimacy. Furthermore, author suggests possible solutions that do not require electoral democracy for China's most powerful rulers.
Consequently, Bell argues that the most evident problem that challenges political meritocracy is the problem of corruption. It undermines not only the legitimacy of a communist party, but also the very purpose of building a political meritocracy composed of rulers with a public spirit. The author states the following reasons for emergence of corruption: the lack of independent control over the government, China's economic development, transition to a market economy, low salaries of the officials, and the lack of ethics. These reasons seem to be deeply rooted, but contemporary China exercises some degree of challenges to prevent any of these reasons for corruption to develop more broadly. For instance, the government of China has reduced the number of corruption cases related to the internal administrative process by strengthening the merit-based public services system, improving the budget and auditing system, and improving control over the activities of local authorities, as well as making progress in anti-corruption regulations and law enforcement. Author points out that there are many ways to fight corruption without resorting to the principle of electoral democracy. For example, establishing independent checks on political power, reducing dependence between the public and private sectors, raising salaries of government officials, and implementing a more systematic program of Confucian moral education can help root out corruption.
The next vital problem that is associated with the ways to implement political meritocracy is the ossification or stagnation of political hierarchy. It's widely known the idea notion for meritocracy is a system where people are selected by their superior abilities and virtue, but as of now the political hierarchy is increasingly made up of elites from narrow social backgrounds, which in turn leads to the problem that talent from other segments of the population may be overlooked in the political selection processes, as well as the political elites that downplay their social background when they are selected become more arrogant and less sympathetic, which leads to people's interests being disregarded. Here it would be good to mention the École Nationale d'Administration, ENA, in France. It was an institution designed to realize political meritocracy. Its aim was to select the country's intellectual political elite regardless of social background and train them for public service. Following 2 years of ultra-competitive education and training at the ENA, the graduates were basically guaranteed jobs in the civil service. The previous director of the ENA, Bernard Bocau, specifically highlighted to have a good comprehension of the needs of society, the administration must come from the whole of society. No matter how open or talented the person, there are some things that can be known only from personal experience. Like this, people in France will not vote for ENA graduates viewed as privileged elites with neither the motivation nor the knowledge required to work for the interests of the public. Like this, Nicolas Sarkozy was elected at least partly because he was viewed as different from the ENA-molded political elite. The authors summed up by saying that the more political leaders come from diverse social backgrounds, the better the quality of policy making would be. The only way to remedy the problem of a ruling class largely composed of people from a privileged background, from author's perspective, is to improve representation of diverse social groupings within the political elite.
The last problem of implementing political meritocracy in the context of China is the problem of legitimacy. A government can be called legitimate when it's morally justifiable in the eyes of the people. The people are empowered to give this legitimacy to the government. The Chinese government has managed to achieve a high degree of political legitimacy without resorting to democracy in the sense of free and fair and competitive elections of the country's leaders. Nationalism, performance legitimacy, and political meritocracy are 3 points that author mentioned as sources of undemocratic legitimacy. Performance legitimacy is a very pragmatic strategy, which means that the government relies on accomplishing concrete goals such as economic growth, social stability, strengthening national power, and governing competence and accountability to retain its legitimacy. The author comes to a conclusion that the problem of legitimacy can be only resolved through democratic reforms, including some form of explicit consent of the people, while the problem of corruption and ossification could be addressed through various mechanisms that don't require electoral democracy.
The next essential aspect that the author describes is inability, or in fact inability, to reconcile meritocracy and democracy. That leads us to examine three models of democratic meritocracy: democracy and meritocracy at the water level, horizontal model with democracy and meritocracy at the top level, and vertical model with democracy at the bottom and meritocracy at the top.
The first model emphasis on the voter level basically embodies the idea that if people want capable and virtuous political leaders, they will vote for them in elections. But there is a huge obstacle that prevents China from implementing democracy at lower levels, and that is about how the population, which are relatively uneducated rural people, lack the wisdom to make the right policy decisions, while also ordinary citizens often lack the competence and motivation to make morally sound political judgments. Sometimes they misunderstand their own interests as well.
On the realization of the second model, a horizontal one with democracy and meritocracy at the top, there are three different points of view. For instance, Sun Yat-sen, who proposed the two additional branches of the government, aside from legislative, executive, and judicial, oversight branch and examination branch. To say briefly, democracy and meritocracy can be combined by requiring political leaders elected by the people to pass competency tests. The purpose of the independent examination is obviously to ensure that the examination process isn't influenced by political considerations. Another valuable proposal was made by Jiang Qin. He objects to the idea that there is only one source of legitimacy. He proposes the three types of legitimacy, which are celestial, sense of morality; terrestrial, history and culture; the human will is the will of the people.
As for the last, the third model, a vertical one with democracy at the bottom and meritocracy at the top, it seems to be the most plausible way at the reconciliation of democracy and meritocracy. As author himself says, in the Chinese context, the idea of democracy is widely supported at the local level. In a large, densely populated, modernizing country, it seems immediately reasonable to assume that different criteria for selection and promoting should be applied at different levels of government. At the local level, democracy is desirable, but the process must become increasingly bureaucratic as we move further up the hierarchical ladder. Of course, there are possible drawbacks of, for instance, the probable imposition of restrictions on voting in order to ensure a more rational process.
The author's concern with this book was to defend political meritocracy, the idea that political power should be distributed in accordance with ability and virtue. The book contains key features of the Chinese model as both a reality and ideal, while acknowledging the need for more detailed academic analysis and future research. Author comes to a conclusion that the most politically realistic and morally desirable way of combining political meritocracy and democracy is the implementation of vertical democratic meritocracy. But of course, it also includes experiments between local and central government to reach a perfect balance.
It goes without saying that experiments are morally desirable only if successful experiments are expanded and unsuccessful ones are discontinued. In the end, these experiments are the key to explaining China's ability to adapt and succeed over the past 3 decades.
Essentially, the Chinese model is a phrase widely used to describe China's approach to economic development and governance since the reform era in the late 1970s. Author goes further to explain his thoughts on the possibility of applying the China model to other countries, which results in the answer: no, the Chinese model cannot be easily adopted by countries with different histories and cultures. Moreover, this model only works in a large and diverse country that is committed to a peaceful form of socio-economic modernization under meritocratically selected leaders. And all of this can only be implemented by a ruling organization like the CCP.
Having read and analyzed this book, we highly advise everyone to do the same, as the concept of political meritocracy described in this book breaks so deeply entrenched belief in the democratic ideals. This book helps us to realize that to every model there can always be an alternative, and we as a society should strive to develop and modify the existing system, gradually eliminating imperfections.